Professor Charles Ngwena. He is a barrister at law. He's a professor of law at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. He also sits on various editorial boards and committees. He is the convening editor of the African Disability Rights Yearbook. He is also the convening, he is also the section editor of the Developing World Bioethics Journal. And he also publishes on the intersection between health and human rights. And then the second speaker of the session is Ms. Fides Nkuni Kawanda, who will be presenting on the experiences of parents and teachers in prepping adolescents with autism spectrum disorder for sexual life at Bauleni and University Teaching Hospital, Special Schools, Lusaka, Zambia. Fides is a special education teacher and a part-time lecturer at the University of Zambia. She is also a teacher in charge of special needs. And she is studying towards a PhD in special education at the University of Zambia. I would now like to call upon Professor Charles Ngwena to deliver his address.
Oh, can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, you can hear me. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Sabia, for the opportunity to speak on the topic of conscientious objection. My paper is really something that I have begun to think about, but haven't really crystallized it in a clear way. And so I'm very much looking forward to also hearing from participants what they think about the topic of my discussion. The first thing I would like to address is why we are discussing this topic. Why is the intersection between parents, teachers, and learners with disabilities important for us, in particular in relation to the protection, realization of sexual and reproductive rights? It is important because the educational sector provides an opportunity for learning. And one of the questions we would like to ask is, what type of opportunity does it provide? What is it that educators can impart to learners with disabilities? And if so, what do parents think about the role of educators in the protection, respect, promotion, and fulfillment of sexual and reproductive rights? Equally, from the teacher side, we would like to ask about the role of education. What place does it have in this topic that we are discussing today? But perhaps the first thing to say is to concede that sexuality is an important part of our life. It is an integral part of human life, and therefore it is not surprising that we expect the educational setting to address the topic in the manner in which it intersects with a learning environment. And yet we know that the topic itself of sexuality and reproduction gives rise to controversy for the reason that for cultural and religious reasons, we have different views about the topic. We come to the topic already into thinking about sexuality and reproduction in a particular way. But yet we know that there is evidence that children who otherwise could receive sexuality education at home do not solely depend on the home environment. They also depend on places of worship and the school as institutions which can provide them with an opportunity to develop ideas, to understand the issues that are implicated, and to understand their own place as human beings in a society where they are growing up. So it is important that we should think about how to systematize sexuality education in our schools. And we know, and there is evidence from research, empirical evidence, which clearly demonstrates that parents do not always feel comfortable about discussing issues relating to sexuality and reproduction with their children. So therefore, there is a legitimate role for government. There is a legitimate role for schools. And the question is, what kind of role can government play? What kind of role can the school play? And most of the controversy in sexuality education are related not so much to the overall objective of giving life skills that enable learners to make choices of their own, knowing the consequences of their choices. The controversy relates to the content of that education. We do not always agree as to what teachers should discuss, what teachers should impart to our children beyond describing the physiological and biological connection between sexuality and reproduction and a learner who is growing up. So we disagree about what constitutes appropriate sexuality education. And in similar vein, we also disagreed about what constitutes appropriate, say, adolescent sexual behavior. So this is the background of my paper. I wanted to give a rationale and explain the reasons why we are discussing this topic. Also, I want us to reflect before considering the ultimate issue. I want us to reflect on the purpose of education. What is it that we expect from education? What is it that we expect from a learning environment as it applies to children? My paper really focuses on schools rather than on tertiary environments. One of the things we can say about education is that it is intentional. It is a structured process of imparting knowledge and skills in order to influence the learner's developmental course. So we do it deliberately, knowing that if it is done well in a structured environment, it will contribute to the acquisition of knowledge and skills that impact positively on the development of the learner. But the question is, what is it that this education should encompass. If a learner is to acquire literacy in sexuality and reproduction, what kind of details must the learner be exposed to? So that's where the disagreement becomes apparent. There is controversy as to how far educators should go in including knowledge that is beyond biological facts and physiological facts to address the personal and social skills of learners as they intersect with sexuality and reproduction. So that is really the context of my paper. The context of my paper is to highlight that when it comes to issues about personal and social skills that are needed in order for our learners to be well equipped to understand their own sexuality, to understand their own potential as persons who can have reproductive capacities, we think very often that this perhaps is not the role of, it is perhaps the role of parents and the church, especially when we think about it conservatively, when we think about it in a religious way. We tend to want to say that schools do not have a role to play in terms of contributing to the psychosocial issues that relate to sexuality. And of course, we cannot dispute that parents are in fact primary stakeholders in the impartation or imparting rather sexual and reproductive health and rights knowledge. We know that sexual socialization begins very early when children are in fact very small at home, where parents have the opportunity to emphasize their most deeply held values. We know, for example, that from a very early age, children are exposed to messages about modesty, about nudity, about privacy, such that by the time they attend school, they are already conscious about the importance of modesty. They're already conscious about the importance of covering their bodies. So this is an important role that parents play. We also know that when parents, for example, respond to infant masturbation, to displays of physical affection, parents always have something to say to their children, and by the time they come to school, they already have a sense of some of the boundaries. But the question is, how much do parents achieve in socializing their children in relation to sexuality and to reproductive? How far do parents discuss values and behavioral expectations that are or that play out in sexuality and reproduction? So that is really where we begin to question whether parents can be the only institution that should play a role in sexual and reproductive socialization. Yeah. So the point I am trying to develop here is that whilst parents have an important role to play, they are not the only players, because the school provides an important environment for filling in the gaps that research tells us that parents are unlikely to fill. So I begin my topic about conscientious objection by acknowledging that the state does recognize that parents to educate their children in a way they see fit, and that this obligation usually means that parents can indeed object to certain types of sexuality education if they think that those approaches are in conflict with their deeply held moral beliefs or religious beliefs. Now, how might this play out in terms of a rights discourse? And I'm getting closer now to the topic that I would like to discuss, which is a conscientious objection to sexuality obligation. I begin by highlighting that if we look at our constitutions, all our constitutions, you will find that they contain provisions relating to freedom of conscience. So the question is, how might this relate to the topic that I'm discussing today? But let me begin by saying that yes, all our constitutions recognize the right to conscience. Equally, our international human rights instruments recognize a right to conscience. And for the purposes of my presentation, I single out Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which guarantees a right of conscience. And I would like to highlight that the Human Rights Committee has described the right to conscience in Article 18 as a most far-reaching and profound right to underscore its importance in our lives. But at the same time, the committee has also highlighted that when we read Article 18 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, we should also notice subparagraph 3, which permits limitations to that particular right. The right to freedom of conscience can be limited for reasons that by law and are necessary to protect public safety, public order, health, or morals, all the fundamental rights and freedom of others. I'm interested in the last exception, the limitation on the right to freedom of conscience on the ground that it impacts on the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. So yes, it is an important right, but it is by no means absolute. It is important that if parents raise an objection to sexuality education on the grounds that the education that is being provided would otherwise be in conflict with their deeply held philosophical beliefs, moral or religious beliefs, we should, I think, concede that they have a right to make such an objection, but at the same time, we should also be able to say that the right of parents to exercise conscientious objection is not absolute. It can be limited, partly on the grounds that it may violate the rights of others. And who are those others? I put it to you that those others may come in two forms. It can be the right of teachers themselves exercise their vocation and impart knowledge in the manner in which they have been contracted to do so. But even more importantly, I'm thinking of the rights of the learners themselves. I'm thinking of their right to be exposed to an education which enables them to develop knowledge and skills for understanding and exercising their own sexuality or reproductive capacities later on in life. So let me try now to speak more closely about the right to conscience. First of all, to say to you that why I became interested in the right to conscience is that historically it has really not been applied in the sphere of sexuality and reproductive sexuality and reproductive health and rights education. And you may ask the question, where has it been applied? Now, historically, the right to conscience was developed to protect the rights of persons that were against being conscripted into the army. So that is how it developed. It was a reaction that much as a country can declare war on another country, when it comes to recruiting soldiers who are required to use lethal force, then they should also recognize that there may be citizens who hold very strong views about not taking the life of others, so that they should be allowed to exercise that freedom and that they should not be exposed to discrimination. Later on, the right to conscience was developed in the context of abortion, and much of the literature, if you do a Google search on conscientious objection, you will find that well over 80% of the articles published on this topic are really to do with conscientious objection to abortion. The realization that abortion is underpinned by controversy and that there is no consensus. And part of how we give recognition to the fact that there is no consensus is to concede that those who do not wish to participate in procedures for the termination of pregnancy should be allowed to do so. But there is one important development that is aligned, if you like, to the recognition of a right to conscience, which is that the right of conscience should be exercised in a manner that recognizes the rights of others. So it is one thing to object, but it is another thing to also impose your view on another person. So if we think about democracy, and if we think about why we manage to thrive in a democracy, it is because we think that the recognition of diversity is an important characteristic of a democratic society. A democratic society does not always require us to agree on all major issues. It also allows us to differ. And then the remaining question is, how can we differ? We differ by recognizing that a person has very deeply held religious beliefs. They should not be coerced into acting contrary to those beliefs. At the same time, we recognize that rights are not exercised in a vacuum. They impact on the rights of others. So that's to how we can think about um, sexuality education. And I just remind you once again that the controversy relating to sexuality education or to sexuality education or life skills education as it relates to sexuality and reproduction is never about the overall objective of that education. It is always about how far teachers can go in talking about sexual diversity. For example, many parents object to sexuality education that discusses gender identity, for example, discusses the rights of transgender persons. Many parents object to sexuality education that raises awareness about lesbian and gay sexualities. Now, the question is, if we take seriously the role of education, we should also concede that for a learner to grow up in a more rounded way, they should be able to understand that in the environment they find themselves, in the country in which they find themselves, human beings come in all shapes and sizes. And the diversity of human beings is something that we cherish and we should promote. And we do so in part by ensuring that as we educate the learners, we also give them an opportunity to understand about sexual diversity, to understand about different approaches to reproductive health and rights, so that they can make a decision of their own, not disregarding the beliefs of their parents, but also ensuring that they are not deprived of learning about others. So it's always about how we meet each other. Yes, we do respect the rights of parents. Yes, we do respect the rights of teachers, but in practice, we want to develop an approach which takes into account that to have sexuality education that works efficaciously, you need to be able to negotiate the tension between what parents want, what learners want, and what educators can do. So one of the things that we can do, and I'm sort of saying this as a way of concluding my paper, is that though parents are eminently suited and generally should be the main institution for providing education about sexuality, nonetheless, they are not the only institution that can perform these roles. So both parents and educators have essential roles to play in fostering sexual literacy and sexual health and reproductive health. as a way or as a precursor to realizing sexual and reproductive rights. Yes, parents should play the primary role in imparting to their children social, cultural, and religious values. But at the same time, it is important to develop what I describe as a consultative model of sexuality education. A consultative model, and by this I mean that in developing sexuality education, schools should consult with and involve parents in order to consider what is essential to include in the curriculum. Now, we're not giving parents a right to veto, but we are saying that they have a right to be consulted. They should be involved in the development of curriculum relating to sexualities. And we can also say that those parents who oppose sexuality education should be allowed to justify their opposition so that they can explain what it is about content that they regard as objectionable. So this is a way of interacting, just the very process of interacting with parents, the very process of involving parents in the development of curricula, in the end, leads us to a dialogue between the school, between the teachers and the parents, and it allows us an opportunity to develop a model that is consultative, that gives all stakeholders an opportunity to have a say, but ultimately we should be guided by a philosophy of education which sees education as going beyond mere literacy and learning of symbols to embrace psychosocial development. So, in other words, I'm saying the sexuality education should promote dialogue about sexual values with parents and teachers in order to provide a more conducive environment for empowering learners at school. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very interesting discussion, Professor Charles. Any questions will be asked at the end of the session. And I'll invite Ms. Fides to present on her topic regarding students with autism spectrum disorder. Yes. Ms. Fides, you may take the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yes, I'm Fides Nguni Kaunda, and my presentation is based on experiences of parents and teachers and teachers in preparing adolescents with autism spectrum disorder for sexual life. And my study, I did it at Bauleni Special School and University Teaching Hospital Special School. Looking at the background of my study, when we look at the autism spectrum disorder, we are saying this is a disorder which happens within the first 3 years of life and can be found in children with other disabilities like visual impairments, hearing impairments, also cerebral palsy. So when we look at autism spectrum disorder, this is where we find these children, they have restricted, repetitive, stereotyped rigidity and behaviors and interests which are restricted. They also have problems with social interaction as well as communication across multiple contexts. Then the children actually revealed anxiety when their activities as children with autism are interfered with patterns of behavior, which would be often be met with rage and panic. Looking at why I focused on that title, here in Zambia, there's little research done in the area of autism spectrum disorder. Hence, the prevalence of learners with autism spectrum disorder is not yet known. And we have scant information from the Central Statistics Office in Zambia, as well as from the Ministry of General Education. So disability acts, also, laws and acts are instruments also through which countries abolish discrimination against persons with disabilities and eliminate barriers towards the full enjoyment of their rights and their inclusion in society. But when the researcher checked out on the list of countries actively participating in these rights, Zambia was not among the list of, on the 30 rights and freedoms set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And when I looked at the Penal Code Act of 139 of Zambia, which states that any person knowing a child or other person to be an imbecile or person with mental illness has or attempts to have unlawful carnal knowledge of that child or other person in circumstances not amounting to rape. So looking at that act, that was actually clear evidence to say that there's nothing better for these adolescents with autism spectrum disorder to have knowledge on their sexual life and reproduction. Why do I say so? Because the Penal Act, the Penal Code Act 139 of Zambia still calls these people as imbeciles or idiots. So which means even when we look at this sexual life, because already a tag has been put on these individuals, so which means they don't even care about their sexual life as well as knowledge of them on reproduction. So the researcher actually needed also to find out more on these rights. Parents of children with intellectual disabilities or those with autism spectrum disorder in Lusaka reported that there were challenges to meeting the social needs of their young adults or their young children. So they find it's very difficult. How do they meet these challenges that these learners or young adults are going through? Then coming to the issues of preparing them for sexual life. Some parents too have no idea of how to prepare these learners for sexual life. This provoked me actually to undertake the study because there's a big gap in this source of information, and it is very worrying because I happen to handle especially learners with autism at a school where I'm teaching. So most of the adolescents and young adults are just locked up in homes for fear of being sexually abused. Parents and teachers equally have scanty knowledge on how adolescents with autism spectrum disorder are prepared for sexual life. So that was just a background to my presentation. Then my research was guided by the following objectives. The first objective was to explore how adolescents with autism spectrum disorder view sex life. The second objective is to describe experiences of parents and teachers on how they prepare their adolescents with autism spectrum disorder for sex life. Then the third objective was to establish interventions on how adolescents with autism spectrum disorder can be prepared for sex life. So when I look at the findings of my study, the first objective on how adolescents with autism spectrum disorder view sex life. So according to the findings, most of the parents interviewed reported that their adolescents with autism spectrum disorder have limited knowledge about sexuality and found it difficult to understand sexual education. So even as you talk to them about their sex life, about even their parts of the body, it's difficult because these young adults, they have problems with the social communication. They have problems with also social interaction. So it was difficult for them to tell, even if they are aware of any sexual education about their children. Then teachers also interviewed reported that they lack proper teaching aids and support from relevant authorities to make these adolescents with autism spectrum disorder understand sex life. So even as we go into schools, especially our Zambian schools, you would find the comprehensive sexuality that has come into schools. It's more favoring learners without disabilities. If it favors, then it's those learners with physical, hearing, and visual. When it comes to learners with intellectual disabilities, these learners are always sidelined because they feel even if we share this knowledge, they can't understand and they won't take it anywhere. So why waste time on such learners instead of focusing on those that are able to understand what is being shared to them? So looking at the second objective on experiences of parents and teachers on how they prepare their adolescents with autism spectrum disorder for sex life. So some parents interviewed reported that they underestimate the sexual experience and activities of their adolescents with ASD because they assume that sexuality is non-existent or irrelevant until their adolescents with ASD are sexually abused. They feel their children, they don't even have feelings about, they don't have sexual feelings. So they find it to be irrelevant until these children are abused. That's when they realize that there's need for these children also to be educated on such matters. Then teachers also interviewed reported that adolescents with autism spectrum disorder have a tendency of sneaking out of the classroom to have sex with fellow friends and others who do it from within the classroom if the teacher goes out. There are times that these learners, when you are not in class as a teacher, you are teaching them, you would find they'll perform the act within the classroom. Then this goes to the teacher now, which means these children, they know there's such a thing. They have got feelings. So how are we going to go about it? Educating them to tell them to say, this is not the correct place for such activities? Or how are we going to educate them to say these things, they have time? So such things are not there. So which means teachers are lacking in those areas, because if such an act can happen in a class, then where is the teacher? Have we done enough teaching to these our learners so that they can understand to say these things are not supposed to happen in the classroom? When I looked at the interventions on how adolescents with autism spectrum disorder can be prepared for their sexual life. So teachers and parents should practice social interactions with adolescents with ASD during role play. For example, you could role play talking to someone at a park or at a party, asking someone to go to engage in sexual activities. You could also role play what to do if a person says yes or no to engaging in such matters. So these things on the interventions on what teachers and parents need to do. There's need for these learners to be engaged in role play. You act it out, because these learners, they have feelings, they have sexual feelings. They would want also to offload it on someone, but they don't know the way to follow it through. So there's need for teachers and parents to work together so that we engage in a role play. We communicate to them to say these things, they need to be done like this. There must be consent when you want to engage into such, not you just find this child and you get and you abuse. And there are times that these children, especially 16 years and above, when you look at, mostly you would find that it's boys that are affected. They are the ones that you would find they are in this autism category. And at 16, that's when they are more active in these matters. We will find you are teaching in class as a female teacher, and you would find their manhood are ever rising in class. So now you would wonder, how are we going to help such learners? And they don't even understand it. They would just be giggling when you're talking to them. So all the time, all we just do is time out. But when are we going to engage health talk with them so that they can understand to say, what I'm going through is this. But parents usually, they don't even have ideas. Then the other thing is parents and teachers must set some boundaries about appropriate behavior. For example, following someone around or frequently touching them is not okay. So we need, as teachers, to make sure that these learners, we teach them, especially the inappropriate touching. So in the role play that was talked about, such things should be taught so that our learners, they know that is, the touching is not appropriate. Then when we look at the same interventions, we find that masturbation and private places for autistic teenagers, you would find mostly, especially like I said, boys, they have in that tendency where they would do masturbate in class. So as teachers and parents, we need to help adolescents with autism spectrum disorder recognize private places, where we say a private place is somewhere in their own home where other people cannot see them. They might also need to make a list of private places with pictures or photos. So when we are looking at these private rooms, we need to emphasize to them, because even in our schools, you'd find each and every time they want to remove their private parts in class. Even when they are pressed, because that sense of shame is not in them. The secrecy is not in them. So we need to help them with pictures so that they know this thing is not allowed in this place. The best place for this thing is maybe a bedroom with a door closed and curtains drawn. That's when such things can happen. Or even in a bathroom where they are alone with a closed door. In a shower, they can do that. So we need, as teachers, to realize, to say, we need to help these children or these adults to identify private places. Then sexual relationships and health and sexual health for autistic teenagers. So as adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, they go through puberty and learn about sexual feelings. So teachers and parents will need to talk to them about sexual relationships. It's at this stage when they reach puberty or even adolescence, 16 years plus, when we need to start engaging them in health sexual relationships. They need to know that. Then it is also important for them to know that sexual relationships are a normal part of life, but they do not have to have sexual relationships if they do not want to. It's a normal way we need to talk to them. But if they do not want, they shouldn't be forced to enter into such relationships. Then they do not have to have sex to be popular or because their peers say they should. I've seen this when I once visited a rehabilitation center on the Copperbelt province here in Zambia, where these children, adults, adolescents, they went for their skills training. You would find where they are there, they were just being abused. No one was there to educate them. And when they engage into such, it's like that would be their own activity. They would want to do it more and more. This is the time that we need to come in as teachers, as parents, to tell them, yes, they were abused and they found this thing to be interesting, but there must be some limits. We need to sit them down and educate them, because immediately what has been found when I ask further questions, when I went to that same place, when they are active, when they are sexually active, it's like now everything that they do, they would want to be engaging all the time in these sexual activities. So we need, as teachers, to start talking to them that this thing, it has time. So as teachers, as parents, we have roles to play in the lives of these adults as we prepare them for sexual life as well as reproduction. Then there's also need for consent and safety for autistic teenagers. So consent means that these adolescents need to feel comfortable about any kind of sexual activity. The other person also needs to be comfortable with it too. So even as they engage in such matters, we need to make sure that they consent to it. And they need to be comfortable to engage into such matters, not where it is just forced on them. Then adolescents, they also have the right to say no. So we need to teach them those skills of saying no when they don't want. So all young people have their rights to control what happens to their bodies. And these adolescents should never feel pressured into doing anything that doesn't feel right. Because these adolescents with autism, because they are problems in communication and as well as social interaction, we have found that a lot of people, they have taken advantage of them, of just wanting to do anything to them because they know they're not going to voice out, because they know they're not going to tell anyone. So these things, as parents and teachers, we need to make sure that we educate our young adults with autism spectrum disorder. Then there's also need for safety. We need to make sure that these, our learners, are always safety precaution so that we safeguard them from those vices. Then in my conclusion, I would say adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, like any other adolescents, have sexual feelings which come as a result of reaching puberty. Not only reaching puberty, if I go back to what Professor Ngwena was talking about, those things are inborn, they are in them. They just come to manifest when they reach that stage. So we need to realize that, because we found that most of the parents, they lock up these adolescents, because, and others, they would go to, if it is for women, they have their wombs removed because they feel they are not human beings who can't engage in such. Then, despite parents and teachers agreeing that adolescents require help in sexual life and reproductive, they admit that they have not done enough to help adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. So most of the parents that I talked to, they have done nothing, because when they see that these children reach adolescent, they are actually withdrawn from schools, fearing that these will just now be sexual tools in the institutions where they will be. So that should not be the case. All we need to work out with teachers and parents is to educate them on these sexual matters instead of withdrawing them from schools. A number of them in Zambia would find, I've handled a number of learners in schools. After 16, we transition them. So where we transition them, you would find that where they would go, they would just be being abused. So parents feel it's better to withdraw them and just lock them up in homes, because even in homes, it's also not safe. You would find the uncles, aunties, they are also abusing them. So what is the way forward? Instead of locking them up, there is need to educate them. Then it also has been established that the law through the penal code is very discriminatory, as it categorizes children with autism under idiots and imbeciles. This thing I need.
Can you kindly please conclude your presentation?
Okay. So on the recommendations, parents and teachers and other stakeholders need to put their efforts together to promote greater awareness of and knowledge about autism spectrum disorder and sexual life to general educators. Also, professional development training and resources must be delivered in creative and compelling ways to ensure practitioners are well prepared to meet the educational and transition needs of adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. Also, parents and teachers repeatedly called for schools to undertake efforts to enhance attitude towards children with autism spectrum disorder, so that everyone in schools have knowledge about autism spectrum disorder. Then sexual education must be taught in a highly structured, individualized way by using concrete strategies with less of an emotional tone. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much for according me this opportunity to be part of the presenters in this conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that very interesting presentation. I have two questions for each panelist. So firstly, for Professor Charles Ngwena, the first question is, with the consultative model of sexuality education, there'll obviously be, differing views on what should be included in the curriculum. So how exactly do we, yeah, how do we exactly, just negotiate and, come to a solution or, something that everyone can agree on. And then the second question, Professor Charles, is that how can we address some of the negative attitudes that parents have towards sexuality education for their children with disabilities? And then we have two questions for Ms. Spiders. You spoke about teachers and parents doing role play. What exactly does this role play involve and how does it help? And then the second question is, how do parents of children with autism educate them on sexuality in a way that they can understand? Are there any easy to use resources for parents that you can share? Professor Charles, you can take the floor, and thereafter Ms. Spiders.
Oh, thank you very much. And I know that we would like to wind up, so I won't spend a lot of time, but I will try and do justice to the question. I think that towards the very end of the paper, I suggested that we could fall back on a consultative model of sexuality education, so that we do not develop the curricula at the exclusion of parents. I don't think we should do that, because if we do, we are going to miss out on the inputs of primary socializers. It seems foolish to leave out parents when you design a curriculum in a controversial area, because after school, the children go back to the parents, they go home. So a better approach is to engage. Now, by consulting parents, we are not suggesting that they have a power of veto, because that would be non-productive. What you want to do is to enhance deliberative democracy and inclusion in a democratic society. So you give the parents as an important constituency a voice in how you develop. So first of all, you clarify what the goals of education are, and then you consult parents as to what they would like to see. So it is really through institutions such as school governing bodies or parent-teacher associations that in practice you can implement consultation. You don't do it just rhetorically. You do it through institutions that have been created to allow parents to have a say. So at the end, we know that in a democratic society, there is what we call consensus, but there is also what we call dissensus. So we know that in certain areas, we can't always agree. And therefore, the question would be guided by our philosophy of education. And as I try to argue that education goes beyond symbols, it includes the psychosocial development of a human being. When Fides from Zambia presented, she gave us the details of, in fact, she was making a case for why teachers are an important stakeholder in providing education, because much of what they confront in the classroom is probably because parents have not done their work as primary socializers. They have shied away from those issues, and therefore teachers have, if you like, an unavoidable role to play in filling the gaps that parents have left. So that was one question. I'm not sure what, I can't actually remember what the second question was. Please refresh my memory.
Thank you,
What
Prof.
was the second question?
The second question was, how can we address some of the negative attitudes that parents have towards sexuality education for their children with disabilities?
Yeah, so again, I think that what I was trying to suggest with a consultative model is that it plays more than one function. is not simply an opportunity for parents to simply inform the school about what they think is right, but it is engagement, it's a dialogue in which you sit round a table as a school governing body or a parents teachers association. Each side will present its case, and that is the dialogue. You have an opportunity to educate each other. Each one will convey their anxieties and fears, and the other side has an opportunity to address those anxieties and those fears. So without these practical institutions for interaction, you can't really achieve the objective of educating parents out of the biases. In practice, you want to educate parents that in any society, yes, we think parents have a primary role to play in educating their children, but also take into account that children will leave home. They go into different environments. They should be able to understand the terms on which they interact with others. It's like saying that you shouldn't teach your child that wearing clothes is important, because if you don't, they might think nudity is okay. So this happens graphically in the examples that were given by Fides, where clearly the learners with autistic conditions were coming from a background where family has not done what it could have done to expose them to the scenarios where you may have sexual feelings, and you should know how to express those feelings without injuring your own dignity or without injuring the dignity of others. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Charles. I'd now like to give the floor to Ms. Fides to answer the two questions that were directed to her.
Okay, thank you so much. On the part of role play that teachers are supposed to do, when you look at role play, our adolescents with autism spectrum disorder, they depend more on visual. So when they see things, they don't forget easily. So it's advisors, teachers, where we need to come up with pictures or objects where they need to see. This is a female reproductive organ. This is a female reproductive organ. And you tell them exactly what happens. And even when you're doing a role play, you tell them, if somebody touches my breasts, this is how I'll defend myself. If somebody touches in this private part that I'm not comfortable with, you need to role play such so that they're able to see. So immediately I'll go and touch, they would say, no, it's bad manners, because there are learners who do such. Immediately you'll say that, they would say, no, it's bad manners, and they would avoid. So every day you keep on engaging them in such skills, they will be able to learn and understand. And even when you see a male adolescent, maybe their things are erected, what do? You tell them this is not the place. You start now giving pictures and role play. We have private rooms in schools where I need to take them. This is the place where such things can happen. You go in, lock up. When you know these things, you calm down, then you can come out. So such things, they need to be done. Equally, as we are doing that in schools, these things should also be taught to the parents. They shouldn't just leave out these children to say they don't know anything. We need to teach them. We have a case at school where this girl child, immediately she comes in, should want to put her hands in her private parts, openly where everyone is seeing. So sometimes I sit down and wonder, it's a thing that have been on my mind all along and I want to develop it further. So this is the time that you tell this child no to that, and immediately you even show the face, they will be able to say that thing is not wanted at this time. So we need to make sure we help them from time to time so that these things, they enter their brains, they see them. The important thing is make visual objects so that they are able to see. Immediately they see that, then those things, they will stay in them and they will not forget. So I feel by doing role play, and if we do that, we also need to engage parents so that they are also aware in case those things, because they're also happening in homes. These children are abused in homes. So we also need to make sure that even home, they have understood. As we do that in class, even at home, the community at large also needs to be educated on such, so that these adolescents, they are accorded the dignity of also how to live in society. I think I don't know if I've clarified your questions.
You have. Thank you. The second question was from Miss Margaret Zulu, and she said, how do parents of children with autism educate them on sexuality in a way that they can understand? Are there any easy resources for parents that you can share?
I think the easy sources that they can get, it's just the visual aspect, where they have realized this child is behaving like this. We need to engage in, like I said, parents and teachers, they need to work together. The visual aspects that are being used at school, they are the same visual aspects that can be used at home. This is where parents and teachers, they need to work together to overcome such. If parents, they notice something that they are not happy about it, let them share with the teachers. If teachers also notice something that they are not happy about, let them share with parents. So together they can overcome such. But the most important thing is we shouldn't hide, because there are times that these children are also, we don't know, parents, they don't realize that they see most of the things that is done in homes. If parents, they are kissing in an open place, these same adolescents, they come into class, starts kissing their friends. Then you would wonder, where did they get that concept? So sometimes you'd ask parents, where we saw your child doing this. So you probe further, then they would say, I think maybe it happened. They saw this thing to somebody in their home. So we need to start teaching. We need to be aware and cautious even in our homes. We shouldn't think these children, they don't see anything. They actually see everything that we do. And what they see, those are the things they go and also do in schools. So we need to make sure that we work hand in hand with parents, also parents with teachers, in order to help adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fides, and thank you to Professor Charles Ngwena for a very, very interesting session. We will now be going on a 45-minute break until 2 p.m. South African time. So if we can have everyone back in 45 minutes. Yeah, thanks once again to the panelists and to the participants.
Oh, great. Just take some minutes.